We are going to help you have your first conversation definitely within 3 months. And when they have that conversation, it just blows their mind. It opens up their world. It's going to be messy. You're going to feel like an idiot. And that's okay. That's just part of the process. I wanted to tell her, I've just made this YouTube video. I look really cool. And what I ultimately said was something along the lines of Ich bin geil. So instead of this video is cool, I said I'm horny.
This is the Language Podcast, and I'm Richard Simcott. On the show today, we have Benny Lewis, the Irish Polyglot. In this brand new series, we're giving you the tools you need to start learning a language. From speaking to listening, to reading and writing, our expert guests and polyglots share their methods, tips, tricks, and hacks to get you started. Whether you're new to language learning or just want to add another language to your arsenal, this is the place to be. Today we're diving into speaking. Speaking is often what we talk about when it comes to language learning. It's how many languages do you speak, not which languages do you know. Speaking really is a focal point for many. And this is something Benny Lewis highlights prevalently in his work, specifically the idea of speaking from day one. You may have spotted Benny on YouTube. He runs an immensely popular language learning blog, Fluent in 3 months. He's also the author of a book of the same name. Even though he wasn't raised multilingually, using his language hacking techniques, he's learnt to speak more than 10 languages. And in his language hacking series of books published by Teach Yourself, he shares his method. The aim is to get you to have a conversation in another language as quickly as possible. Benny, first of all, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
What should people do? How do you start with all of this speaking stuff in a different language?
I guess what's interesting for me is I came to the polyglot community from a different perspective because I am first and foremost a traveler. I am a nomad. I have been nomadic for 21 years. So my entire passion is to go to the country where speaking the language just is a priority. Obviously, there are other advantages you can have if you're able to write the language in terms of getting a much wider scope of jobs. But for the most part, speaking is a priority. So it's just baked into my DNA that you have to prioritize speaking. Obviously, I understand that maybe for a lot of listeners, there are other aspects of learning the language that are more beneficial to them. But for me, I am just extremely passionate about speaking because of the practical aspect, especially with somebody who travels. Because of that, I don't see language learning in a necessarily academic way. I know many people wouldn't, but I see it much more as a means to an end. So I'm not actually passionate about language learning. The language is a tool for me that opens the door of allowing me to make new friends with a different culture. And because it's a tool, I see it more like trying to learn how to ride a bike, where you don't have to learn the aerodynamics of how the bike goes through the wind to be able to ride it. You don't need to learn trigonometry to know what angle you might need to turn the handlebar. You just need to get your ass on the saddle and start pedaling, and you will fall down. And that's the thing. This is my way of looking at language learning. And so speak from day one means like riding a bike. You're not going to learn the theory. You're going to learn by doing. It's going to be messy. You're going to feel like an idiot. You're going to feel self-conscious, but you're going to learn a lot quicker. And the main goal for me is communication. So I accept that there will be a lot of mistakes up front, but with time, I can drive those mistakes down. And I've sat my C2 diploma exams, so I've reached those higher levels in the languages, but I've only gotten that level of momentum because of speaking from day one.
And people listening to this will think, speaking from day one, I don't know if I can do it. Is it for everyone, or do some people need training wheels, or as we call them in the UK, stabilizers, to be able to really get your feet off the ground and start that process? Or is it as simple as you say, just get the bike, pick it up, sit down and ride, and don't worry about falling over? I mean, are there many ways to do this, or is it just one way? What do you think?
Oh, there's millions of ways to do it. The most extreme way, which I don't actually even recommend to people, is get a flight to the country right now and start speaking as soon as you get off the plane. That is an extreme method of immersion, which I have done in the past, but there are too many disadvantages of it. So a version of using stabilizers is something that is open to a lot of us, and that's just by getting online interactions with a native speaker. Ideally, if you can afford it, you might get a paid tutor through various different websites that you can find them. Or if you can't afford it, you might do a language exchange where you would speak English to them and they'll speak their language to you. But the whole point is you're speaking with somebody who is a very different kind of interaction compared to what you would have if you just got off the plane right now in the country. Because you're talking with somebody who is only talking to you, so they know they can adjust their speech in a way they wouldn't with other native speakers. They are going to speak more clearly. If they're an experienced teacher, they're going to do this in a much more structured way because teachers understand the perspective of the student that they're coming from. So they know how to simplify things, and they may even know how to sometimes unnaturally use certain cognates that may not necessarily be the best version of the word to use in that situation, but the other speaker is more likely to understand. And there's so many ways a good teacher can create all of these stabilizers for you that make it a much less intimidating experience. And then on top of that, there's little tricks I use. Like my most recent project that I started from scratch last year was Korean. And I did the same thing. On day one, I had a lesson booked with a native speaker, and I told that native speaker, I have one rule, absolutely no English. Mm-hmm. Because I did not want it to be like my remnants of secondary school, where when I learned German in school, the teacher would speak in English, explaining all of these das tables to me. And it just didn't have this sense of an actual language for me. I didn't believe German was spoken. I just thought it was this theoretical thing taught in schools. So because of that, the idea of learning it like more in a more adapted way with somebody means you're going to adjust for all of these things. And what I did with my Korean was I cheated a little bit. I used Google Translate. The teacher would have said blah, 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 blah. And I said, could you write that down? I had learned that ahead of time. And they would type it into the chat. So it wasn't ideal. And that level of stabilizers is not something you want all the way into the intermediate stage, obviously. But it is something that at least gets you out of the mindset that I absolutely need to use English to have some form of communication. And that was essential. There's a very big psychological component here that a lot of us just rely on English so much that we can't imagine communicating without it. So we need to let go of that misconception to allow ourselves to move forward. There's got to be a lot of frustrations because you're communicating in a very unnatural way. You're extremely limited, and you just have to accept this. And I think I don't necessarily have good skills as a language learner. I'm not extremely talented, or I'm not very smart. But what I do have is a bit more of an endurance to put up with that frustration. I think that is a skill that is so much more beneficial to beginner language learners. You just accept you sound like an idiot, and that's okay. That's just part of the process. And you work through it that way, and eventually you don't sound like an idiot. Or one of my favorite quotes, actually from a cartoon, is the goal is to suck a little less every day.
Definitely a fun way of looking at it. I was wondering though, like, let's break it down a little bit, because I can hear screams of people who have been in my classes before now, and I want to kind of work through those questions with you. The first one would be, okay, well, if I speak from day one, what am I actually saying on day one? And do I need to do anything before that? What does that look like?
Yeah, so again, I think psychologically people might be prepared for that. Speak with a native speaker on the street what could I possibly say to them? And that is an extremely high pressure situation that you may expect that person's in a hurry, they don't have time for you or whatever it is. But when you're talking with somebody online, there's so many things that have been relieved of that situation. There's an expectation that they're going to be less pressure on you to perform. And when I'm selecting a teacher, one of my criteria is that I want them to be doing all the work in terms of giving the conversation a direction. When I have a teacher, and I would test multiple teachers out, like in the first week, I might hire 5 or 6 different teachers. And the goal is to whittle them down to the 1 or 2 that I think I'll go ahead with. But there are loads of really good teachers out there, and they know how to keep the conversation flowing. And they will give you a sense of being a lot more invested in the conversation that takes that pressure of you to feel like, oh my God, they're judging me and thinking I'm an idiot. So that is not my problem to solve. My problem to solve is I need to communicate in this language. A good teacher is going to solve the other problem of let's have this conversation flow so that this student feels a lot less awkward.
And where are you getting the first starts of the conversation? Because, I mean, you say you're having these conversations, but where does the actual initial set of vocabulary or sentences that you want to say, where does that come from for you?
Well, typically, I know there's something I'm going to have to say, not just in that very first conversation, but in general, throughout my life when I meet people, there's this typical elevator conversation that you're going to have that you tell the basics about yourself. I'm Benny from Ireland. I'm traveling. I'm a writer. I'm a YouTuber. I like sci-fi. These like basic things that if you had to summarize yourself in 30 seconds, what would that summary look like? So write that out in English, copy and paste it into Google Translate. It's not going to be perfect. I am not saying Google Translate is the solution. It is something. That's what you want here. You don't want perfection. And the same comes down to resources. Later on down the line, you're going to want to look at which books to get or which online courses to go through. And it's that same question of if you're bogged down by perfectionism, I need to use the exact perfect course, which is obviously the language hacking courses. Everybody knows that. My 5 language hacking books are the perfect course. But, putting that aside, obviously there is no perfect course in the world. So you just use something that's good enough. And that's the key for all of this. Your conversations don't need to be perfect. They need to be okay. Not a complete disaster, only somewhat of a disaster is fine for that first conversation.
I mean, I can see the logic in what you're saying, because really, whenever we meet new people, we meet several people, not just one person, right? So these kinds of introductions and greetings are the things that we say many, many, many times. And it's that repetition, I guess. Like you say, you had many teachers, different teachers on different platforms, whether it's language exchanges or actual teachers who will help you in the language learning process. But you are always going to have to introduce yourself, and you are always going to have to say these key elements that you're going to hone in, I guess, and sort of fine tune and get right over time.
Exactly. And you'll begin to get that level of feedback. I don't necessarily want too much feedback from my teacher. If what I'm saying is completely wrong, I do want a correction. But if I use a masculine instead of a feminine, article or whatever it is, I don't necessarily need to worry myself about that as the absolute beginner stage. I am absolutely not of the philosophy that you can't teach an old dog new tricks and that you have fossilization of mistakes that'll stay with you forever. I categorically don't believe in that. So I'm fine with making these mistakes and knowing that they will perhaps be with me throughout the entire beginning stages. Mm-hmm. And then at the intermediate stages, I become the world's biggest grammar fan, and I study those books and I do those exercises and I take the tests because that's the right point in my language learning journey to be polishing things up. So when I say speak from day one, that does not mean speak from day one until you're fluent. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's possible. You need a dynamic learning approach. So what I tend to talk about most in my writing is what people need to do in those early stages. But that's only to get you with the initial momentum of speaking. Then what I do in the intermediate stages is actually not even that exciting. I just study grammar books and I do exercises and I have lessons that are much more along the lines of trying to correct my mistakes, because I feel like I've had enough conversations about what I did last weekend. I'm ready for the hard stuff now. So that's a dynamic learning approach. And when I get to the advanced stages, again, I change my approach. And you always try to ask yourself, what is the biggest problem I need to solve right now? And when you're a complete beginner, the biggest problem is bare bones communication. You just need to be able to say something and understand something. Obviously, the ideal is say everything and understand everything, but that's not a good triage system. Like if you imagine a hospital, you have one guy with a stubbed toe, another guy with a gunshot wound. You obviously have to see the guy with the gunshot wound. So think of this triage system in your language learning, and communication is the absolute bare bones key. You need to be able to communicate at some level as an absolute beginner. And then when you can do that and you're having those conversations about your favorite food and all these like typical basic conversations, then it becomes a different story. And now you're ready to, well, I'm having kind of tedious conversations. I'd really like to have interesting conversations. And then you can work to expand upon your skills.
I mean, what you're saying makes sense to me. I've seen people in classes where, for example, they'll get stuck on a point where the teacher will explain something or will be talking about something in a very practical way, but they'll want to know, and I think it's possibly from that traditional learning practice that you mentioned earlier, of I need to know how all of this works from day one. And what you're saying is actually, no, you don't. You need to know how to do what you need to do to communicate. Then you can layer in later the other elements or understand the reasoning behind it. And to be honest with you, the people I've met who have really insisted on knowing everything in a number of these classes haven't carried on. They've kind of got bogged down so much that it became overwhelming and just way too much to carry forward. What kind of major barriers have you seen with getting people to actually start speaking a new language?
Quite a lot of them. I think the biggest one by far that doesn't really come up in a lot of discussions with language learning is the psychology of it. A lot of people imagine language learning as a problem to solve is solving grammar and vocabulary. Once you know enough grammar, enough vocabulary, you'll be a good speaker of the language. But in my experience, there are so many other issues. There's anxiety. If you are an anxious person, and I can tell you, I have met people who on paper are so much smarter than me. I remember when I was trying to learn Czech in Prague a very long time ago. This is one of my first projects on the blog. I came across this lady who was an absolute genius. She was like a walking dictionary where you could give her the most random word in English and she would tell you the translation in Czech. And I think I asked her a couple of questions about grammar and she explained it to me perfectly. So her Czech theoretically was just through the roof, excellent. Whereas I was this backpacker guy who didn't really care that much, who was just trying what he could. And I was speaking caveman Czech, just the worst Czech imaginable. I was using the nominative dictionary form of the word, and I didn't care that, obviously, for Slavic languages, you have to change those words. And I just threw it together and I had a conversation and I started making friends. And I was hanging out with this lady. She didn't say a word all night long. And at the end of the night, the Czech people that we were with, when they talked to me privately, they said, "Benny, your Czech is so much better than hers." And I was like, "Are you crazy? Like that's just wrong. It's just categorically wrong." But the impression that they got was different. And the reason was her anxiety, her level of perfectionism. She felt she needed to know so much of this language before she dared speak because of all the judgment that might happen. And anxiety is not something you can solve. I can't just say a magic word and people don't have anxiety. I can only reassure people that what you're imagining the other person going through in terms of the level of judgment and how frustrated they are with you that you're speaking the language is significantly smaller, if not nothing, compared to what you actually think is happening. And there was me sounding like an idiot, and I knew that the Czechs were not judging me and that they just enjoyed having a conversation, and they were aware that I was just beginning in the language. So obviously I was going to make so many mistakes. And it's something I try to reassure people as you make mistakes. And I know it's very hard if you're a perfectionist. It's very hard to let go of this, that you feel like you'll be judged. And people can point to certain examples. Like the most typical example people often give is Parisians. And they imagine maybe they went to Paris, they tried to use French, and they got a negative reaction, and therefore they should never speak French again. And I also had that experience, but after I really dived into it, I realized this was not a language learning issue. This was a cultural issue. And now when I go to Paris, I don't have this same experience. And it's because I've realized there's a certain expectation when you're speaking French as a foreign language in how you're supposed to act from a Parisian's perspective. And this was a cultural question rather than a language question. And once I broke through that cultural gap, my experience in Paris completely transformed. Whereas most people would say they're impatient or they're rude to me or whatever because my French isn't good enough. Therefore, until I'm at a C2 level, until I've been studying French for years, I shouldn't dare speak with these people. But that's not what it's about. There are other interpersonal interactions that are happening that sometimes are dictating how things are going. And that's an extreme example. I can't really think of many places in the world where they will be impatient with you or act a little frustrated if you speak their language. So I think that psychological barrier that people are going to judge me is very hard to get over. And it's why I do recommend these like more private experiences where if you're paying a teacher, you're essentially paying for patience.
In your experience, what's it been like having these first interactions when you speak to somebody who's fluent in the language? I mean, you say it doesn't always have to be perfect and that you can make mistakes, but how do you deal with that?
So I go into this with a very different mindset. I have long ago put aside that perfectionism, and I think of a different goal. Because so many of us, when we're trying to learn a language, our goal is to be ourselves as we are in our native languages in that target language. And that is completely unrealistic. That's something that perhaps can be a goal you have in a couple of years' time. But right now, that's not realistic. So let's change that to a different goal. My goal is to be a caveman in the language, and that is fine. Me want go supermarket. I will say whatever version in the language sounds as grammatically horrible as that sentence. But when you hear that sentence, you know what I want to say. You understand me. So the conversation can progress. And that's my goal. It's communication. It's that I can make myself understood and that I can understand at least most of what they're saying. So it's fine when I'm saying what I'm saying. When I'm hearing what they say back to me, then again, perfectionism comes in to block us here. Because of course, when they say something to me, I don't understand that entire sentence they said. So I could conclude, therefore, I don't understand anything. But I think of it more like a noisy telephone conversation. If you're on a very bad connection, you might hear somebody come through and like blurred their voice a little bit and say, dinner tomorrow, and that's it. You just hear those two words. So you can conclude, I don't understand, the conversation has hit a brick wall. Or you can extrapolate. So I would extrapolate based on the context of where I'm at in this conversation, and that the fact that they asked me a question that had the word dinner and whatever tonight, then maybe it's likely they're saying, do you want to have dinner tonight with me or whatever? Yeah. And I would guess. Now, obviously, it's possible that I would guess wrong. And if you allow yourself to think about it, if you guess wrong, what's going to happen? Is the earth going to open up and swallow you whole? Are you going to burst into flames? No, you're not. I can attest this by experience because I have made a lot of mistakes. I have misunderstood a lot of times, and yet life has gone on. And with time, you'll suck a little less every time you do this.
Yeah, I think the sucking a little less every time you do it, I think is a really good thing to think about, because we definitely will not be great in the beginning, and we may not be great after many, many iterations, but the communication is definitely really, really important. Love, travel, study, work, friendship. Whatever your reason for wanting to learn a new language, Teach Yourself provides the tools you need. With a mission to demystifying the language learning process and make it accessible and enjoyable for everyone, Teach Yourself aims to provide the best resources possible to empower any learner at any level to use a new language. Teach Yourself celebrates linguistic diversity and encourages an exchange of ideas, new connections and opportunities through the joy of language learning. Choose from over 70 languages and teach yourself today. Listeners of the Language Podcast get a special 20% discount on Benny's language hacking books. Go to teachyourself.com and use the code in the show notes. Rely on Teach Yourself, trusted by language learners for over 85 years. One of the things that you mentioned was not going into English and not wanting people to speak English with you. Now, it could be English, but it could be another mother tongue that other people in the target country language speak. And I guess the question does come up, why is it so important to completely avoid the other language? And I mean, is it really doable, or are there other tricks that you have to be able to make sure you're getting what you want or you're communicating what you want if you don't know the word?
So this again comes to the psychological aspect, because I know it sounds unrelated, but I get people asking me this question of, I want to learn my spouse's language and I've tried to practice with them and it never goes anywhere. And I say to them, the problem here is that you have burnt into your brain that the language I speak with this person is English. And that mental barrier is extremely difficult to get over. And that's why I generally tell people, if you want to learn your spouse's language, get a different teacher. And that teacher is somebody who from day one, you can build in your brain, I must use this language with that person. I absolutely cannot fall back to English, because that's a slippery slope. If you speak in English sometimes with your teacher and sometimes in the target language, then maybe the last 10 minutes of the lesson, you're feeling, I've worked too hard, I'm just going to ask them how they're doing in English. And that's fine if you want to make a friend, but you're not really getting the absolute best benefits out of that time with the teacher. So for me, it's a psychological thing. I want to train my brain that there are people in the world who I can only speak this language to. It doesn't matter to me if they're bilingual in English. I don't want to know about it. I don't care if they have any English. Sometimes I prefer that they don't have English, because that makes it even less of a temptation from their part to potentially slip in. So that's the most important part for me, is the psychological thing that I need to train my brain that this is a language I need to use to communicate with this person. I can only use this language. Now, when you don't know the word, then you might be able to muddle through. If you're an absolute beginner, you may not have enough other vocabulary to walk around it. So again, I'll cheat. I'll use Google Translate. So technically, there is English happening in this conversation by me opening a tab on my browser and typing the English word. But what's important for me psychologically is all the words coming out of my mouth going to that teacher are coming in their language.
Yeah, I mean, that's really, really good thought on it. You can still make recourse to other techniques, well, things that are written, whether it's Google Translate. I suppose if you're traveling and you've got restrictions on what you can eat, maybe because of allergies or something, I suppose you could also have things written down, couldn't you? And you could order and maybe fluff some of the things, but you could then just show them a card that expressly says, I have a severe nut allergy for these types of nuts, or whatever it is, written in the language that maybe if you don't feel confident with how you've said it and they've understood it, at least you know, and you've maybe had that checked with somebody who speaks the language, just to kind of be a bit of an extra support to the communication.
Yeah, exactly. So like you can fill those gaps if you need to with some form of English that you've used to translation. But of course, that doesn't take away from the fact that maybe you're still only going to try and speak the language.
Exactly. I mean, and they're not weaknesses, they're just supports, I think. I think you're absolutely right. They're supports to the whole system of actually learning. What other things do you think, okay, well, what do I actually really need to be able to say in this language? And why is it relevant to me?
So I think one of the issues that I had in school that made it so like inhuman to me was that I wasn't exposed to it through human means. So when I became an English teacher and I wanted my students to get a bit more invested in the English language, rather than just teach all of the grammar and vocabulary, I asked them, what are you interested in? And because this was early 2000s and I was in Spain at the time, they told me their favorite TV show was SpongeBob SquarePants. So I decided to make the entire lesson about SpongeBob. So instead of, when I wanted to teach prepositions, I said, he is in the pineapple house, and whatever it might be. And that gave it a completely different context for them. So when I'm learning a language, I think to myself, how do I relax in the language? What ways do I use to wind my day down? And how can I incorporate that? So as an example, I like flicking through TikTok. So I'll bring up the app and I'll just be swipe up, and I'll watch random videos. Mm-hmm. And what I've done since in the last few years is I've simply created brand new accounts which you can switch between very quickly, not just for TikTok, but also for X, for YouTube, for Instagram. I have a completely different account for every language I'm trying to maintain. And in that, when I'm logged into any of those accounts, I train the algorithm. So if a video comes up that's of a cute puppy, but the captions are in English, I'll say, not interested. Doesn't matter how much I might otherwise like the video. If it's not in the right language, get it away from me. I might use a VPN on my phone so that on Android you can change your GPS location sometimes as well, just so that it makes it think that my phone is in that country. But then other than that, you can search for the right hashtags. Once you find a few people, you can follow them, you can follow who they follow, and eventually the algorithm learns, okay, this guy only wants to see content in French, even though he's in Paraguay right now, which doesn't make sense to me, but whatever. I'll make this guy happy. And through that, the algorithm shows me what I want, and I relax through that language. And it's the same if you relax through Netflix. Get into watching your Netflix shows through the dubbed version in the target language or the original shows made for that language. There are lots and lots of ways that we can relax. If you like listen to the radio, you can stream the radio from every single country in the world right now, no problem. There are a million ways you can get what I like to call virtual immersion. And this helps me to get an even bigger sense of the language being a true living language. Even when I'm not in the country that I could get exposed to, I can still give myself that virtual immersion that I can feel almost like I'm in that country.
Yeah, very good tips. I think, social media is an amazing tool for this. And I definitely enjoy seeing all of my social media in different languages as well. And when people talk about speaking and actually using the language as well, one of the big things that comes up is pronunciation. And I know growing up in the UK, people used to say, oh, well, I feel a bit silly putting on a voice or putting on an accent or making myself sound like I'm not from here, but like saying it in a funny way. And often also some of the friend groups, they would tease people who could do this well, which is kind of an odd thing, right? But I mean, how important has pronunciation been for you on your journey?
So in that triage system we talked about, I put pronunciation on the level of when I'm in the C level of the language, then pronunciation is one of my biggest priorities. But when I'm in the A or B levels, it's really not that big a deal. as long as I am understood, even if I sound like the most typical English-speaking tourist, then it's fine because that's my goal is communication. Whereas you can train yourself. And it took me a few weeks of lots of practice, but I finally eventually got the R in Spanish when I thought I'll never be able to make this sound. And, there are loads of YouTube videos that'll teach you how to make these individual sounds. But what I actually do in the C levels is I tend to go in a slightly different direction, because language teachers are very good with giving you the content of the language, but they don't necessarily have the skills to teach you the individual positions of your tongue and how you're going to form your mouth and how the tonality and musicality of the language works. So something I've done several times, but only at the C levels, is I've gotten a music teacher who has taught me how to sing in the target language. And a music teacher has their ear tuned so much better. Either a music teacher or an accent trainer or somebody who works with people who have difficulty speaking. All of these people have a certain level of training. Even though they tend to help natives, what they know applies just as well to second language learners. And I use this especially with the likes of Portuguese. And my Portuguese teacher told me that when you're speaking Portuguese from Brazil, you have to go up and down and speak through your nose. And yes, it sounds like I'm making fun of the language, but ultimately this is a musicality that is different to how us native speakers sound. And it's something you need to adapt. And when you do it, you sound a bit more authentic. And I've had it happen to me that Brazilians think that I'm Brazilian. Because keep in mind, there's plenty of white Brazilians. It's not like I'm going to pass for a Chinese or Korean person when I'm in those countries. But there are a lot of countries that I can potentially pass for a local. And I've used this trick of learning how to sing through the language because these people are so skilled at it. But again, it doesn't matter for the lower levels. It makes no difference as long as what I'm saying is close enough that it's understandable. So I will try to get at least the letter R that is so different in English compared to in so many other languages. I'll try to get that as good as I possibly can. It won't be perfect, but it'll be close enough initially. And then people are going to understand, they're going to have conversations, and later on I can tweak it.
Benny, the interesting thing with you is you said obviously you're a traveler first and foremost, and languages are a tool for you. And you didn't grow up bilingually or multilingually in the traditional sense of it. I mean, obviously you had Irish at school because you're from Ireland. But how did you end up getting known as the Irish Polyglot?
So I graduated and moved to Spain, and I lived in Spain for 6 months. And I did what I've seen so many people do, and that's just gravitate to the English-speaking bubble. So I did what is a bit more natural for a lot of us when we have our gap year or whatever. And so this is why part of what I was trying to do for so many of those years was to address that community, because those are the people I kept meeting who were living in the country for potentially years without having learned the language. Initially, for those 6 months, I really wanted to figure out what is it that differentiates them from me. Why are they successful and I'm not? And I put aside, maybe there's a language gene. I put that aside for now, because if that exists, that's not going to help me. So let's presume that doesn't exist and that there is an actual solution to this problem. That's how I wanted to tackle it. And I tried a lot of things. I tried traditional classes, and I was the absolute worst student in the class. I still remember the teacher would ask me a question, and I would just venture, C? And I would always be wrong, because they'd be asking me where I'm from or whatever. So I was completely the absolute worst student. I thought maybe you can read your way to fluency. So I got El Señor de los Anillos, the Lord of the Rings. And I thought I'll read my way all the way through that book and then I'll be fluent. And it took me weeks to get to page 2, just using a dictionary with every single word. And I still didn't understand what I was reading. I tried even studying the dictionary itself from all the way at the beginning, all the way up. I tried a million things that were just wrong. And ultimately, what helped me was I talked to the people I saw were having success, because I was on an engineering exchange program. And so initially I thought maybe there's a right brain, left brain thing, that you're either good at technical subjects like engineering and sciences, or you're good at the arts and languages. And that mentality was holding me back for a while. But then I saw evidence to the contrary with these other engineers coming to Spain and eventually picking up Spanish. And I would ask them, what are you doing differently? And I was resistant to what they were telling me. I thought there must be some kind of a cassette that they put on and they play while they sleep and it hypnotizes them to being fluent, or some kind of ridiculous secret like that. But ultimately they were saying, we're just speaking Spanish. You know, we're literally getting practice. And you're not, Benny. You're studying and you're doing all these things, but you're not speaking it. So the big experiment for me was I dedicated the month of November 2003 to only speaking Spanish outside of my job. And that was the simplest decision. That was the only rule. I like things that are very cut and dry. It's either this or the other. So the rule was only Spanish. And my Spanish was abysmal. So I didn't know if this would work, but it completely transformed me. That month was a very difficult month. I absolutely did not debate Kantian epistemology with anybody during that month, but I did at least have those first initial basic conversations. And that showed me I could potentially learn Spanish. And after I'd reached a decent level in Spanish, that's when I realized that I wanted to test this out with other languages and started traveling the world, and I haven't stopped ever since.
Wow. And I mean, obviously from that, I guess, you are known in the language learning community and beyond for your Fluent in 3 Months blog and then book and methodology. I mean, how is that? How does it work? Can you tell us a little bit about this idea and the system of getting people to a conversational level in just 90 days?
So part of that was not necessarily getting people to that level. Part of it was trying to really burn into people's minds my language learning philosophy. And one of the issues I kept seeing was that people had New Year's resolutions. I'm going to learn Spanish. And it lacked in all of the very famous SMART goals. It has to be specific and measurable and achievable. All of these things were missing whenever people told me they had a goal to learn the language. So my goal with that level of a title was to demonstrate to people, you need specificity. And this is being specific. I want to reach fluency, which I've very, very accurately decided. I mean, people might disagree with it, but I have decided that means B2. If I reach a B2, then I, in my mind, am socially equivalent. There's lots of those C-level things I can't do. I can't be an engineer in the language, or I can't have philosophical debates. But at the B2 level, I can exist socially like I would in English. So for me, that's where fluency begins. So that's what I'm aiming for. And 3 months is my deadline. So whether there's not necessarily a step-by-step process for this, and I've gotten plenty of criticism for using that title, but that for me is, it's kind of, I like to tell people that ultimately another way I could have gone about this was just having the URL specifictargetspecificdeadline.com. It just does not roll off the tongue as easy as Fluent in 3 months. But that's what I wanted to burn into people. You need specificity. And also 3 months is this Goldilocks zone for me. A year is too far away when you have a goal that you can put things off and not really feel that level of pressure that I feel people need if they're doing something intensively. Whereas any less than that, it's not going to be achievable. You're not going to be able to push yourself really up a notch in these goals. And I've had many Fluent in 3 months projects, and more than half of them, I've not reached my end goal, but that's still been useful for me, because by truly applying myself and pushing myself, like last year with Korean, I did not reach B2, but I did reach the beginnings of B1. And this meant that I had true friendships I was beginning in Korea, and I had interactions, and I was able to travel to every single province and major city of South Korea. because I was doing it entirely through the language. So it opened up a lot of doors to me, even though I did not reach that level of fluency. So it's definitely not a promise or anything. It's just I feel that this level of adventure is missing for people, that you are pushing yourself to have this almost like movie level goal of like a hero's journey, that you're trying to reach this thing at the end. And that for me makes it so much more interesting, so much more fun, that obviously failure is an option. If you had a goal that was extremely realistic, like, A1 or A2 in a few months, then I think that is not necessarily going to give you this sense of adventure in the same way. Now, having said that, that is way more realistic for a lot of people to want to reach that. Just from my personality, I didn't feel that was exciting enough. I needed something as ridiculously high, but still somewhat achievable. And I have made it happen a couple of times, but obviously there have been times that I've gone shy of the goal. And even those times, I've had something to show for a very small stretch of time of just a few months, that I've been able to completely transform my life to have this new language be a part of it. So I do get criticism from people who just see those 4 words and make a lot of conclusions about what I'm about. But what I do for people is I try to show them you need specificity. So if I'm coaching people, I don't tell them you need to be B2 in 3 months. I generally, when I help people, say, we're going to help you have your first conversation definitely within 3 months, whatever that level may be. And that is something that is absolutely achievable for the vast majority of people. And when they have that conversation, that they feel like for most of their life, they've never had a conversation in a foreign language, it just blows their mind. It opens up their world.
Perfect. I mean, with all of these different experiences, learning languages and going on these adventures, I'm sure you must have some funny anecdotes, especially related to language learning.
Sure.
Have you got one that you could share with us now?
Sure. Okay, I'll tell you one that's very funny. When I was learning German, there was this female friend of mine who was visiting me, and what I wanted to tell her was, because I was making YouTube videos, and I wanted to tell her, I've just made this YouTube video. I look really cool in the video. I tried to say that in German, and what I ultimately said was something along the lines of Ich bin geil. So instead of this video is cool, I said I'm horny. And I also said, I wanted to say, do you want to come to my house? And I said it in a way, come and buy me, which can be very confusing because that can also have that sexual implication. So I kind of said, I want you to come in me and I'm horny. And I obviously didn't want to say anything along those lines. But ultimately, when you might imagine this story, you might think for a lot of people, you'd be mortified. It would be the end of your friendship. She'd call the police. You'd be thrown in jail for sexual harassment. No, she laughed and she understood based on the context, because she's a human. She's not a robot or a computer that was processing information. She could tell, obviously, I wasn't flirting with her. So she laughed and she was like, Benny, you don't say it like that. And she corrected me. And even though it could have been the most embarrassing moment of my life, I look back in that and I laugh at myself. And I think that's something that's missing so much for us language learners. When we make potentially big mistakes, rather than thinking it's the end of the world, it's not that big a deal. So if I can laugh at myself for something that could potentially have been super embarrassing, you can laugh at yourself for using a masculine instead of a feminine.
So a final word from you about this embrace being an idiot. Can you sort of tell us how you come up with that and what's in your mind when you say that phrase? Embrace being an idiot.
Yeah, you got to turn things on its head, because with language learning, the context a lot of us come from is the academic context, where every mistake you make is a big red X on your exam paper that brings you one step closer to failing. So if you turn that on its head, my goal with language learning is today I am going to make at least 200 mistakes. I'm going to go out of my way to speak so much that 200 mistakes are just going to happen. And if your goal is to make mistakes, then that completely transforms your entire experience and it makes it a lot more lighthearted and a lot more fun. So those mistakes happen to me, and rather than think, Benny, you're an idiot, I think this is great. I'm getting practice.
What a wonderful way to round things off. Thank you so much, Benny, for joining me today and for sharing your experience and what you've learned over these 21 years of traveling around the world and learning languages as well on the way to get to do what you want to do. And that's a beautiful thing to share with everyone. So thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
A massive thank you to Benny Lewis for joining us on the Language Podcast. Now that we've covered speaking, the next step is listening. For that, we'll be joined by the wonderful Desta Haile, who teaches languages through music. Let me know what you've learned from Benny today. Are you ready, as Benny says, to embrace being an idiot? I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye for now.